All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Metaphysical Bible Hangout. I'm Reverend Sherri James, Senior Minister for Understanding Principles, and I am glad to be here. Happy to be doing my favorite thing on a Thursday evening, which is spending time with you and talking about scripture in some form or fashion, talking about metaphysics, talking about the fact that you and I are divine. We are working through a series right now based on the Reverend Dr. Mary Ann Tompkins' book, The Hebrew, A Student's Guide to the Hebrew Scriptures. This was a workbook that she put together. Gosh, I don't even know what the copyright is for this, but it's a really powerful study through the Hebrew Scriptures. It's very easy to go through and very accessible, and so we have been making our way through it over the last few weeks. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the beginning of, the transfer of power from David to his son Solomon. Transfer of power from David to his son Solomon. We're going to look at some of the things that they were dealing with in the kingdom. I think you're going to see that they were very much like you and me. That, you know, we have this idea that these are ancient peoples and that we don't have anything in common with them. But I think you'll see that we have quite a bit in common with them. They are very much like we are. All right, let's take a minute because, you know, we're going through this, we're looking at the facts, but more importantly, we're really interested in what the Spirit has to give us. And so we just want to open ourselves, want to condition our hearts for that. So just take a moment to just relax. Just open your heart and your mind. We know that there are life lessons in these stories to help us live our spiritual truth. And so we just say thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I bless the conversation tonight. I bless the people that are gathered here this evening. And I thank you, God, for the people who will watch this many years later. I ask for a special blessing on their lives, that what we discuss tonight will have positive implications for their experience and will give them something that will fortify them and improve their spiritual journey. In the name and nature of the one that we call the Christ, I affirm that this is so, and so it is. Amen. One of the things that Reverend Mary was very big on, and the reason that she put this together. So those of you that are familiar with Upchurch or Understanding Principles Church, which is the government name of our church, the nickname is Upchurch. Those of you that are familiar with the Universal Foundation for Better Living, and our other sister churches like Christ Universal Temple, Universal Truth Center, we specialize in metaphysical Bible interpretation. And what that means is that we don't just look at what's literally on the page, that we don't just look at what's literally on the page, but we also look at what is beyond just what's literally on the page. That there is the stories, there are lots of contradictions in the Bible. The Bible is not the inerrant word of God. It is not infallible. You can see human fingerprints all over the Bible. And so metaphysics is a way to deal with that. It's a way to extract the spiritual truth that's in the story that doesn't depend on the facts happening exactly as they are recorded, or even the points of view that were presented in the Bible, because there are a multitude of points of view that we see throughout the scriptures. And so one of the things that Reverend Mary was big on was that before you can do metaphysical interpretation, you actually need to know what the scripture says, that you need to understand what is actually on the page. And what she found was that there were a lot of our students who were very metaphysical happy. They were ready to do the metaphysics, but they didn't actually know what was in the text. And so she created this workbook. There's this one for the Hebrew scriptures. She was also one of the ones that really pushed us to call them Hebrew scriptures as opposed to the Old Testament, because it still is somebody's Bible. And so the Hebrew scriptures, and then there's another one for the Christian scriptures. And it was just to get clear on what's actually on the page, like absent the dogma, absent the what somebody told you is in the Bible, what is actually on the page. And so that's what this study has been about. So let me share my PowerPoint. Saba asks, did she write one for the Christian scriptures as well? Yes, she did. Yes, there is one. Same format, where it goes book by book and literally says what's on the page. And in the same way that we're pointing out, the contradictions in the story and all of that is in there as well. Yep. So, that definitely can be somewhere that we go next with this. But tonight, I want to talk about the books of the king. Yes. Somebody want to make a comment? Go ahead. Do I have a comment? All right. Just mind your background noise. I'll also be mindful of it. I do not mind anybody interrupting me and asking a question, but if you're just sitting on camera, maybe keep it muted so that we can that everybody can hear clearly. All right, so we're talking about the books of the kings. And so the books of the kings trace the history of Israel from the height during the reign of Solomon to its demise by the Babylonians. So the books of the kings, so First and Second Kings, First Kings and Second Kings, they start basically at the height, which is during the reign of Solomon, and they follow all the way through to the demise of Israel and Judah by the Babylonians. Now, I want to go here. The story of the reign of King Solomon is told in the first 11 chapters of the first book of Kings. The story of the reign of King Solomon is told in the first 11 chapters in the first book of Kings. When he ascends the throne, he puts to death all rivals and other family claimants to the power. He puts to death, basically he kills all of his opponents. Where that is from is actually in the second chapter of Kings. And what happens is that David tells his son, basically, kill all of your rivals and kill all of your opponents. And so Solomon follows we're led to understand that Solomon follows his instructions, because the next thing it says is that Solomon, assumed the power. So this is what it says. It says, when the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon, his son. I am about to go the way of all the earth, he said. So be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all your heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. And then it goes on, and then it says, then David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. The city of David is Jerusalem. He had reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. And then this is the last verse. So Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. So essentially, when Solomon ascends to the throne, he takes his dad's advice and he slashes and burns. He kills all the family members that might have had a claim to the throne, and he kills all of the pretenders to the throne that might have tried to go for the throne. And so it's firmly established. What that means is he killed everybody. Now, what's interesting is that God doesn't choose Solomon. God doesn't choose Solomon. David chooses Solomon. And there's nothing in the text that suggests that God chose Solomon. And there's just, something to keep in mind, because remember, the prophet or the judge, Samuel, acting on the inspiration of God, chooses David. But David doesn't follow and choose Solomon according to the same process. He essentially just identifies him as the successor, but it's not explicitly stated that it was chosen by God. Solomon is remembered for two things: his wisdom, and he built the temple in Jerusalem. His wisdom, and he built the temple in Jerusalem. Now, in the Bible, David is second only in importance to and textual space to Moses. This is, I want you to get how important. Remember, I said in an earlier class that Moses is a paradigmatic leader for a prophet for Israel, and so all the prophets come in the vein of Moses. And when you read the things that they do, it's almost as if they're trying to copy Moses. They do it a little differently. So when you get to Joshua is framed in light of Moses. David becomes a paradigmatic king. And so every king afterwards gets compared to David. There were three things that he's known for. He was good at music and poetry. He had great military skill and confidence, and he was a shrewd politician. And so it is with David that the history of Jerusalem as the capital city begins. Up until that point, Jerusalem is not a capital city. And this is important because remember, there's all this tribal warfare that's going, and they unite under David, and he's able to do it fairly nonviolently. Oh no. All right, y'all. We're going to go as long as we can. We've been having power outages in Glendale. No. Okay. How are we going to do this? Okay. God is a healer. All right, let's keep going. I said I was going to do class no matter what. So we're going to just go for it. All right. And I am knowing that Glendale is going to get the power back on. It has been so hot here that's what's happening, that we've had rotating power outages because it's been so hot in Glendale. And so it had cut off before and they cut back on. I thought we were done, but apparently we're not. All right. Let's go here. Well, we'll see. We'll see what happens. So Solomon developed extensive trade with foreign countries. He also avoided major military conflicts. I'm gonna have to just turn this camera off. That's gonna just look crazy. Stop video. Okay. All right. Y'all know what's up. He developed extensive trade with foreign countries, and he also avoided major military conflicts with other nations. So with Solomon, it's very much a reign of peace. With Solomon, it's very much a reign of peace, and this is a big deal because before this point, they have been warring with other nations. They've been warring among themselves, and Solomon is able to basically bring them together. I want to back up just a little bit. And when it says Solomon is remembered for two things, which is his wisdom and that he built the temple in Jerusalem, because he had this reputation as being wise, later tradition assigns to him the writing of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. There's nothing in those books that actually where Solomon claims to have written those books. It's because he is called wise and he gets this reputation that later tradition assigns that to him. But there's no claim in the text itself or Ecclesiastes or for Proverbs that Solomon actually wrote it. Something I want to tell you about the king in Israel. The king in Israel is not divine, like the way that it was in Egypt. The king offered sacrifice, but he didn't play a role in it, in the regular cultic practice. And the king is spoken of as God's son, but this doesn't imply divinity. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor of sonship. And it's equivalent to what, like today we say, oh, well, that person is a man of God or a child of God or but we're not necessarily implying divinity. And so as Yahweh's son, the king is now standing between God and the people as a whole. And so there were three things that were happening in the books of Samuel that we talked about last week. One is that there was a succession plan. There was a crisis of succession, basically who was going to succeed David. And basically it gets resolved. So when we start Kings, the issue of succession is resolved because Solomon has been chosen and he succeeds David. And actually all of the rulers for the next 400 years actually come from the house of David. And those of you that are familiar with Matthew, you know that it's very important for Matthew to trace Jesus as being from the house of David. So this house of David comes up again and again because he is a paradigmatic king. He is, if there's a way to do king, you do it the way David did it. The all military crises have been resolved. So Israel at this point under David is very secure. There's no longer the intertribal warfare, but there's also no longer the warfare that's happening with other countries. And then the religious crisis is resolved. So one of the things that had been happening was that there was all this advocacy for Yahweh only, but people were doing different things. They weren't just worshiping Yahweh, and they were being influenced by the Canaanite religions. And so one of the things that David does is that he actually takes the Ark of the Covenant, which you remember was basically where God dwelled, was in the Ark. And David brings the Ark to Jerusalem, and he conquers the town of Jebus and makes it the capital city, and names it Jerusalem. And then he makes plans for a temple to be built. And David also recaptures the Ark at this point when David comes to the throne had been captured by the Philistines. And so when David recaptures it, he brings it to Jerusalem and he makes plans for a temple that will basically be the house of God. And so it is David that centralizes worship in Jerusalem and then forbids worship of Yahweh anywhere else but in the capital city of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem becomes the capital of Israel in total. So this is part of what makes him that shrewd politician, because he really understood how to create symbols. He knew that people needed symbols. And so he was able to create that for people and to give them something bigger than themselves to believe in. But back to Solomon. Solomon became a tyrant with a luxurious lifestyle, and he has 1,000 wives and concubines. The scripture says 700 wives and 300 concubines. And he built temples for them to their gods. And this is one of the things that is really interesting about Solomon, because Solomon basically tolerated religious freedom. And there is preserved in the tradition this disagreement, like they didn't whitewash Solomon, basically, that the Deuteronomistic redactor definitely has the point of view of Yahweh worship only. And it almost paints Solomon's kingdom in a bad light, because he allows worship of foreign gods by bringing it into the country with all of the wives. So he didn't just marry the wives and create alliances with these other countries, but he also built temples. So it would be the equivalent of, say, our president marrying, we don't have as many different faiths today, let's say, as back then, but different gods, let's say, back then. But it would be like him marrying an Indian woman and building a temple, an Indian temple here, and then he marries a Yoruba priestess and he builds a Yoruba temple. And then he marries a Christian and builds a Christian church. And basically what he's doing is he's introducing all this foreign worship. And one of the perspectives of the Deuteronomistic redactor who put the text together is that what brings you protection is the single pointed focus on Yahweh. Solomon imposed a heavy tax on the people, and he instituted forced labor to build his great projects. The forced labor was called a corvée, and essentially it was forced labor on state projects. One of the things that happened is that he laid down new boundaries for the tribal provinces, which split the tribes apart. And with him doing this, essentially his development projects created classes in the nation. So whereas before there was this agricultural, I'm looking for my notes in the dark. Okay, anyway, I'm going to go from memory because I'm reading in the dark. So what happens is that with these building projects, essentially there are it creates classes. I'm trying to think of something I can make you know. So what's happening in the U.S. right now is that there's all this buildup in the far reaches of the country. So the population in California is exploding. The population in New York is exploding, and the economy for California is bigger than many countries. The budget that Kamala Harris has joint responsibility of overseeing with other members of Congress for California is bigger than some countries, and she's overseeing a vast number of people. It's one of the arguments that's happening right now with the representation that every state gets 2 senators, but that's representing all the people, but California has so many more people compared to the rest of the country. The whole argument that we're having right now with the Electoral College and how leadership is chosen in the country. So all of these things were things that they were dealing with, their language different from ours. But what's happening is that with all of these building projects being imposed on an agricultural community, that it is having a negative effect, because essentially you have people who were largely, everybody was poor, right? So if everybody's poor, there's no distinction. Somebody maybe had a little bit more than you did, but pretty much everybody is living a relatively modest lifestyle. But now with all these building projects, you're actually creating a wealthy class. And so it creates, he lays down these boundaries for the tribal provinces, but it ends up splitting the people up. And so it creates problems. The other thing that he does is that he puts the temple in the palace, and he appoints the high priest. Now, if you want to control what the person says that God says, you appoint the person who says what God says. And so this is what Solomon is doing. And so he is, I want you to get that before they were united under David, and largely under David, they had a covenant theology, right? It's preserved in the biblical sources that there is this tension between these old ideas. The covenant theology is basically the covenant given to them on Mount Sinai. It's called the Sinaitic covenant, right? But it's a covenant theology. And then you have this new royal monarchy theology that's coming up under Solomon. And so resolution, meaning, with them having peace and the building projects, it comes at a cost. From a loose confederation of tribes united by a covenant, we've now got a nation with a strong central administration that's headed by a king. So rather than charismatic leaders who rise as needed, as the need comes up and then fade away. So think about the judges, Deborah and Ehud and Samson. They were judges, but they didn't rule for life. They rose when there was a need in the country or in the nation, and then they faded back into the background. But now you've got somebody who is coming in and does not fade away, and he's now it's a new permanent king from a single family, because all of the kings are coming out of the house of David. If they're not coming out of the house of David, they're not being chosen. And so this royal theology, it combines loyalty to God and loyalty to the throne. And you never had that before. Loyalty to God under the Sinaitic covenant or the Sinaitic theology was basically loyalty to God. But under the royal theology that's now emerging with Solomon, you have loyalty to God and you have loyalty to the king, and it's getting conflated because treason or rebellion against God's anointed is essentially rebellion against God. And so you've got this mixture of the two, and they're in the text. And so, again, the king was not considered divine. The king was God's son, but it was like, he's a man of God, the way that somebody would talk about it in the way in our day, Bishop Jakes, he's a man of God. Well, in his community, they don't mean that he's divine. They mean that he is anointed by God for this season. But with Solomon, you get this shift in how the king and how the monarchy is viewed. And so this is something that he introduces. He's very much a tyrant. He encouraged religious practices that opposed the worship of Yahweh. I think the way maybe to think about Solomon is to think about how we're reacting to our president right now. Number 45, that you've got this way of doing things that is part of the decency of the country. It's how we get things done, and and he's just coming in and turning everything upside down. He wasn't chosen by God. He's got all these foreign wives, and there's this whole he's introducing practices that are eroding at the fabric of the country. If this ain't Solomon. And so near the end of his reign, I'm sorry, I want to read this one thing to you. So this juxtaposition of the king, of the house of the king and the house of God is very deliberate. And so this hill, Mount Zion, on which the palace and the temple inside the palace is built, although geographically small, becomes in the mythic imagination of Israel the towering, impregnable mountain. And so you hear people talking about making pilgrimages to Zion, and Zion. You have people that call themselves Zionists, And what that means is that it is this loyalty to the idea that God named Jerusalem and this particular mount, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, sacred to the Jews or to the Hebrews. So all of this is coming up. It's a really interesting diagram. She asked, what's number 6? Number 6 is worship of Yahweh. He encouraged religious practices that opposed the worship of Yahweh. Okay, hold on, let me go to it. He encouraged religious practices that opposed the worship of Yahweh. So now Solomon's legacy. So I want to talk a little bit about this covenant theology versus royal theology. So under covenant theology, which is what they have under David and leading up to David, Yahweh alone is king. Under covenant theology, there is this direct, we've talked about the suzerainty treaty, which is a type of relationship that is had between a superior and an inferior, or the suzerain and the vassal. And this is the relationship between Israel and God. Under the covenant theory, Israel is the subject of the covenant theology. And covenant theology implies almost automatically a somewhat negative view of the monarchy. The monarchy is unnecessary and can be seen as a rejection of God. The Sinaitic covenant is between God and the nation. And the other thing is that the covenant is conditional. It's premised on Israel's observance of God's Torah, or the law. A violation of the Torah will compel God to potentially uproot them from the land. So the covenant, the Sinaitic covenant, is conditional, and it's conditional on Israel doing what it's supposed to do. Conversely, the royal theology, right, or the Davidic covenant, God rewards David with the gift of an unending dynasty. God rewards David with the gift of an unending dynasty. The covenant is what's called a covenant of grant, and it's a grant of a reward for loyal service and deeds. And the Davidic covenant between God and a single individual, the king. So as opposed to between God and the nation, it's between God and the king. And the king is like an intercessor. And I'm going to tell you why this matters, because this is part of the theology, some of the what we call traditional theology around Jesus, this idea of an intercessor. This started with Solomon, or with the Davidic covenant, this idea of someone operating in between the people and God. But in the original Sinaitic covenant, there is no intercessor. There is no one between the people and God. So you've heard me say that metaphysics tries to get back to what was that original thought, because there was something powerful, something transcendently true in that original thought about who and what God is. And in that Sinaitic covenant, there is no intercessor. And in New Thought, we do not accept an intercessor. We believe in Jesus in the sense that we see him as our way shower. We see him as our teacher. We see him as the example of what's possible for all of us, but we in no way see him as the intercessor of our faith. And so you've got this developing structure that's happening in Israel. Y'all, let's pray for the power. I need some prayer warriors. Pray for the power, because I'm going to have to cut to the iPad in a second. I got 10 minutes remaining on this power. We got a developing urban structure being superimposed on agricultural life. And so it creates class distinctions. It creates divisions between people who live in the town and people who live in the country. You never had a town in the country. Everything was country. But once you introduce all these building projects, Solomon, now you do have all these divisions, and you start getting wealth classes. And so there is this great change that's happening. It's a sea change that's happening in Israel with the nation from a tribal democracy. And so near the end of Solomon's reign, trouble just breaks out everywhere, because nobody, it's upsetting. I mean, it's a drastic shift from what they had. Now, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, that's what goes in that next blank, Rehoboam. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, I'm at the top of page 54. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, succeeded him to the throne. So when Solomon dies, the next successor comes from the house of David. And Rehoboam is summoned to Shechem. Shechem is what goes in that next blank. Rehoboam is summoned to Shechem. Remember, Shechem is where Joshua gets his covenant from God. The city has a very important place in the history. Rehoboam is summoned to Shechem to discuss the national situation with the tribal leaders. So basically, you can think of it this way: it's like they're like the governors, right? The governor of Dan, the governor of Gad, the governor of Asher. These are the brothers of Joseph. They become the names of the different tribes, right? So you've got these tribal leaders from these different tribes, right? The tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes, and there's a national situation because this heavy tax is backbreaking on them. They request that Rehoboam relax the strict policies of his father. And what happens is that he refuses to relieve their tax burden. And so the 10 northern tribes break with Judah and they create a nation state. And they retain the name Israel. So this is where you have what's called the divided kingdom. So the kingdom is united under David. It stays united under Solomon, and then it breaks under Rehoboam, Solomon's son. And because he when he refuses to let up on the taxes, they break away. And are we not fussing over taxes today? How are we going to pay for stuff? Interesting. Jeroboam, he is a former chief of Solomon's forced labor gangs. Remember, that's the corvée, those that where you have to work on state projects. Jeroboam, he had revolted and fled. He becomes the king of the northern kingdom that's now known as Israel. Jeroboam revolts and he becomes the king of the northern kingdom known as Israel. Now, what his biggest task now is to help this nation establish a new separate identity. Jeroboam's task is to give the new nation a separate identity. And so to do this, he has to establish his own government at Shechem. He has to establish his own government at Shechem. So what he does is that he named two old shrine cities, Dan and Bethel. Dan is in the north, Bethel is in the south, as centers of worship to replace Jerusalem. Remember, under David centralizes worship, and he brings all worship to Jerusalem. So the people for 200 years are basically trekking down to Jerusalem, which is in the southern kingdom in the south. They're trekking down to Jerusalem to make their sacrifices because, again, you can only worship Yahweh in the temple. And so when the northern tribes break away, they now have to create opportunities for their people to worship and to establish their own new place of worship. And so what he does is he erects two golden calves, and that's what goes in that next link. He erects two golden calves to help people with their attachment to the Ark of the Covenant as Yahweh's seat. And so he set it up so that each shrine city would have a symbol. And so now what's interesting is that he's viewed by the Deuteronomistic historian at this move as a terrible sin. And so there's a lot of talking against the prophets of Baal and worshiping the golden calf and all of that. But what's happening is that they've got to deal with the fact that they separated, they broke away, they're now their own nation state. But the temple where they worship, the temple where they practice is down in Jerusalem. And so this is why the golden calves are set up in Dan and in Bethel. He fortified and repaired primary cities such as Shechem, Bethel, Penuel, that connected the people to an older tribal tradition rather than the Davidic covenant. Remember, the Davidic covenant establishes David's kingdom in perpetuity. He gives David an unending dynasty, right? That's the Davidic covenant. And what they do is they go back to the Sinaitic covenant, which is basically they remove the intercessor. They get rid of this kingship, right? It's a royal ideology that comes to contest some of the basic ideology of the nation. It is this idea of an eternal and unconditional covenant between God and the house of David. And so the Davidic covenant at this point under Solomon becomes the basis for the faith in the eternity of the Davidic kingdom. And the reason that happens is because in 922, the kingdom divides. 922 BCE, the kingdom divides. But then what happens is that in 722, 200 years later, the northern kingdom falls to the Assyrian Empire. All right, guys, I'm gonna log in from my iPad because my computer's gonna cut out in a second. There you are. Okay. All right. Yep. I know. I'm gonna mute myself. Okay, got it. All right, you guys can. Okay, you guys can hear me? Got it. Okay, let's keep going. Woo! Okay. Let me get this up. This computer is gonna go soon. Okay. So Judah versus Israel. This is where we'll stop tonight. So the under Judah, you get this small population. There is a unity among the people. It is an isolated temple, and it's rugged terrain. But under Israel, it's a larger population. You get tribal factions. It's a vulnerable location, and there are two shrines, and there's rich, fertile land. And so what we're going to see when we come back next week is going to be essentially the fall of the kingdom. It is going to be the fall of the kingdom. And first, Israel is going to fall to the Assyrians. The Assyrians are going to come right to the border of Judah. And essentially, Judah is going to be weakened and is going to become a vassal state where they pay tribute to Assyria. And so essentially, they're when I say tribute, I mean they're paying a tax to Assyria. And so Judah stands for a little bit longer, and then the Babylonians conquer Assyria, and then ultimately take over Judah. And so then we'll get to the Babylonian exile. So I would take your questions, but I got about 2 minutes on this battery before it lets out. Thank you guys for hanging in there with me. I'm literally sitting in the dark. So have a great night, and I will see you guys next week. And hopefully it won't be too hot and we can have power. Have a good night.